The mountains had a particular way of keeping secrets. They did not bury them or hide them beneath false smiles and polite conversation the way people did. They simply stood, ancient and immovable, holding their silences in granite and snowmelt and the long shadows of forests that had never been cut down, and they waited for the world below to catch up to what they already knew. The village of Ashvale sat at the base of one such mountain, a cluster of stone houses and timber rooftops that had existed for so long that even the oldest members of the pack could not say with certainty when the first foundation had been laid. They knew the mountain. They knew its moods, the way the wind changed before a storm, the way certain animals vanished from the eastern slopes in late autumn, the way the path that climbed toward the summit always felt slightly colder than the surrounding air, even in the height of summer. What they did not know, or had chosen over generations to unknow, was what waited at the top of that path, what sat in stillness behind doors that no one in living memory had opened with genuine reverence, what had been sealed and sealed and sealed again beneath layers of institutional forgetting until its existence had become something between myth and embarrassment. The temple of the wolf spirit had not been officially abandoned. That was the important distinction that the Council of Alphas maintained whenever anyone pressed them on the matter. It had simply been deprioritized. Resources had been reallocated. The old priestess order had been dissolved not through persecution, they insisted, but through natural attrition. And if no new initiates had been accepted in 40 years, that was a reflection of changing spiritual needs within the pack, rather than any deliberate suppression. The temple itself remained standing. The path remained accessible. Any pack member who wished to climb it and offer prayers was entirely free to do so. The fact that almost no one did was a matter of personal choice, of evolving beliefs, of a modern werewolf society that had moved beyond the superstitions of its ancestors into a more rational and self-determined era of governance. The council said all of this with straight faces and steady heartbeats, and most of the pack believed them because it was easier and safer to believe them, and because the memory of what had happened to the last family that had argued otherwise was still sharp enough to discourage repetition. Sarah Ashvale was 26 years old, and she had been climbing the mountain path every single morning for 11 years. She had started at 15, the summer after her mother died, carrying a small basket of dried herbs and a candle stub, because those were the only offerings she could afford, and because her mother had told her, in the quiet weeks before the end, that the spirit was not dead. "He is only sleeping," her mother had said, her voice already thin with illness, her hand still warm around Seren's smaller one. "He is sleeping, and he is angry, and he is waiting for someone who still believes. You keep going, little one. You keep the fire lit. You keep the path open. Someone has to, and it runs in our blood to be that someone." Seren had not fully understood what her mother meant at the time. She understood it better now, in the particular way that grief teaches understanding over years rather than all at once. In the slow accumulation of morning spent on a cold stone floor with incense smoke curling through air that smelled of ancient wood and mountain wind. The temple was not grand. She wanted to be clear about that, at least in her own mind, because she had grown up hearing pack children describe it as grand when they were mocking her, performing exaggerated reverence toward something they considered a ruin, and she had spent enough time in the actual building to know that grandeur was not the right word for it. It was honest. It was the kind of structure built by people who had not been trying to impress anyone, but rather to create a container worthy of something genuinely sacred. And there was a difference between those two motivations that expressed itself in every timber joint and every piece of carved stone. The walls were thick, and the windows were narrow, and the main chamber was dominated by a raised dais at its center, where a great carved wolf stood frozen mid-howl, head tilted back, every line of its stone body communicating a sound that had not actually been made in 300 years. Around the dais, channels had been cut into the floor in patterns that Serene had spent years learning to read, old script that the village scholars dismissed as decorative, but that her mother had taught her to recognize as something more deliberate than decoration. They were binding marks, containment lines, The kind of inscription you carved when you were sealing something enormous into a space not quite large enough to hold it. When you were less trying to imprison it than trying to preserve it until the conditions for its release had been properly established. She set her basket down at the base of the dais on the morning that everything changed, the same way she had set it down 10,000 mornings before, and she did not know that anything was different because the strangeness had not yet made itself visible. It was simply an ordinary morning in early autumn, the kind that smelled of cold stone and turning leaves and the particular sharp sweetness of mountain air before sunrise. She lit the incense first, 3 sticks in the old bronze holder that she had repaired herself twice with wire and careful patience. She placed the small bundle of white sage beside it, and the offering bowl of water drawn from the spring that ran beneath the temple's east wall, and the single candle in its carved holder at the wolf statue's base. She settled onto her knees on the worn stone that her own years of kneeling had, polished smoother than the surrounding floor, and she pressed her palms together, and she began to pray. She prayed the way she always prayed, which was to say without particular formality and without any expectation of immediate response, because 11 years of unanswered devotion had taught her that the relationship between a petitioner and a sleeping divine was less about transaction and more about maintenance. She was keeping something alive. She was keeping a door open. She spoke aloud, because silence felt wrong in that space, because she had always felt that the spirit, wherever he was, whatever state he existed in, deserved the courtesy of being addressed as though he could hear her, and because speaking aloud to an empty room was only strange if you forgot that rooms were never truly empty. She talked about the village, the way she always did. She mentioned that Elder Korseth had pushed through the new territory boundary agreement, and that a family from the northern pack had moved into the old Brenly house at the edge of town, and that the harvest looked reasonable despite the dry summer, and that 3 young women had been denied ranking consideration at the autumn assembly, for reasons that everyone understood were political, even if the council's official explanation cited deficiencies in combat metrics. She talked about her own life with the same steady matter-of-factness that she applied to village news, noting that she had been passed over again for the healer's apprenticeship position because the head healer preferred candidates with alpha secondary or beta status, and that her landlord had raised her rent, and that she had found a very good deal on loose tea at the market 3 days ago, and had been drinking too much of it in the evenings. She mentioned, as she sometimes did, that she still believed, that she had not stopped believing, that she understood if that felt like an insufficient reason to wake, but that she wanted it on record, regardless. She had just settled into the quieter portion of her prayers, the wordless part where she simply stayed present and open, when the air in the temple changed. It was not a dramatic change at first. The candle flame did not gutter or spike. The incense smoke did not form shapes. There was simply a shift in pressure, subtle enough that she might have dismissed it as a change in the wind outside if the temple's thick walls had not made such external fluctuations nearly impossible inside. The main chamber, the air felt heavier. Not oppressively so, but substantively so, in the way that air feels before a significant storm when the atmosphere is gathering itself, condensing energy that will shortly need somewhere to go. She remained still. Her hands stayed pressed together. Her eyes, which she had been keeping closed in the meditative portion of her practice, stayed closed, because some instinct told her that opening them prematurely would be like striking a match too close to the wick, that whatever was happening required a moment to complete itself before she introduced the variable of her attention to it. The carved stone wolf at the center of the dais had stood in perfect stillness for 300 years. She heard it move. It was not the sound of stone grinding against stone, which was what she would have expected. It was something more like the sound of a held breath being released, a long, slow exhalation of something under enormous pressure, a settling and a simultaneous expansion, as though the stone had been a shell rather than a substance, and what lived inside it had simply stopped requiring the shell's constraints. The binding channels in the floor around the dais produced a sound she had no comparison for, a frequency that she felt in her sternum, and the backs of her knees more than she heard with her ears, a resonance that peaked and then faded in a slow diminishing spiral. The temperature in the room did not drop. It rose, not to warmth, exactly, but to presence, to the specific thermal quality of a large living body occupying space that had been empty, which was different from ambient warmth, the way conversation was different from background noise. She opened her eyes. If you are watching this story unfold right now, and your heart is already starting to race, I need you to go ahead and hit that like button, because what happens in this next moment is the kind of thing that this channel lives for. And we are only just beginning. He was not what she had expected, and she recognized, as she processed what she was seeing, that she had never consciously formed an expectation, which meant that the not what she expected quality of him was coming from somewhere deeper than thought, from the part of her that had been shaped by 11 years of devotion into something that functioned almost like instinct. He was enormous in the way that ancient things are enormous, not simply in physical dimension, but in the sense of depth that they carry, the sense that what you can see accounts for only a fraction of what is actually present. He stood on the dais, where the carved wolf had stood, and where the carved wolf had been smooth gray stone. He was all contrasts, dark hair and pale skin, and eyes that were the particular shade of amber that happens when firelight meets old gold, and he was looking at her with an expression that she could not name immediately, that she would later understand was the expression of someone encountering the first genuinely familiar thing after a very long time in an alien landscape. He said her name, not a question, not a greeting exactly. He said it the way you say the name of a place you have been trying to get back to for longer than you can comfortably calculate, the way you might say home after years of absence, with recognition and relief and a complicated undertow of emotions that the single word was not technically equipped to carry, but that it was carrying anyway through. Sheer necessity, she said, in a voice that was considerably steadier than she felt. You are awake. You kept the fire lit, he said. His voice had a quality that she could not fully attribute to any single physical characteristic. It was deep, but that was not the primary thing about it. It was resonant, but that was not quite right either. It was the voice of something that had existed for long enough to have developed harmonics that ordinary human speech did not contain. Layers beneath layers. In the same way that old music contains frequencies that newer recordings lose. He stepped down from the dais, and the binding channels in the floor pulsed once with light as he crossed them, and then went dark in a way that felt like a door closing rather than a light extinguishing. He was wearing clothing that was simultaneously ancient and not incongruous in the way that she could not entirely explain. Simple, dark fabric that moved with him, as though it had always existed specifically in relationship to his body. He was looking at her with those amber eyes, and she was aware of something happening in the space between them, a pull that was not quite gravity and not quite magnetism, but that shared their quality of being invisible and undeniable. I kept the fire lit, she confirmed. I know. I heard every prayer. He paused, and in the pause she felt the weight of what that meant, the specific quality of being heard across 11 years, across the sealed distance between living and whatever state he had existed in. Every single one. She had prepared over 11 years for a great many possible outcomes of her devotion. She had prepared for continued silence. She had prepared, in the private optimistic hours of early morning, for some form of acknowledgement, a sign, a sensation, a shift in the quality of the air that might signal reception. She had not prepared for this, for him, for the specific reality of a being she had devoted herself to as a matter of faith. Suddenly standing 6 feet away from her with eyes that already knew her name and a voice that treated her continued presence as the most natural and expected thing in the world, she discovered that she was not afraid. She thought she probably should be and was not, and the absence of fear had its own information in it, pointing toward something she did not yet have the language to fully articulate. There are things I need to tell you, he said, about what I am, about what you are, about why. It was your prayers, specifically, that broke the seal. He looked around the chamber, at the familiar carved walls, and the ancient bronze fittings and the worn stone floor, with an expression of complex recognition. And there are things happening in this village and in this region that are going to require action before we have the luxury of addressing any of those explanations properly. The council, she said. He looked back at her. The council. They sealed you. They had help. He said. And they have had 300 years to build a structure specifically designed to ensure I could not be unsealed. The fact that you managed it anyway is either a tribute to your persistence or an indication that the structure has weaknesses they were not aware of. His expression shifted toward something that might have been the beginning of a smile if circumstances had been slightly different. I suspect both. She looked at this impossible being in the temple she had been tending, alone for over a decade, and felt the full weight of the morning settling around her. The particular gravity of a moment that she would mark time by for the rest of her life, the kind of before and after that happens without announcement and reshapes everything that follows. She thought about her mother's hand, warm around hers, about the candle stubs and the dried herbs and the 10,000 mornings of speaking into silence that had turned out not to be silence at all. She thought about the rent increase, and the denied apprenticeship, and the 3 young women turned away from ranking consideration, and the careful institutional machinery of forgetting that had been grinding against her, and everything she represented for her entire life. Then we should probably not waste the morning, she said. And the wolf spirit, who had been sleeping for 3 centuries, looked at his devoted priestess with those ancient amber eyes, and something in his expression settled into a recognition so complete that it had no word for itself in any language currently spoken in the village below. And he said, "No, I do not think we should. This is the beginning, and if your heart is already full from these first moments, wait until you see what comes next, because this story is only gathering itself. Subscribe if you have not already, because we are going to need you here for all of it." The days that followed the unsealing were strange in the particular way that transitions between impossible and real are always strange, full of a dissonance that the mind attempts to resolve through ordinary activity, even while the heart is quietly rewriting every assumption it has ever held. Seren went home after that first morning. She did this deliberately, as an act of conscious discipline, because she understood that Kyle, which was the name she had been saying in prayers for 11 years, and which fit him with the intimacy of something long established, rather than something newly learned, needed time to orient himself, and because she needed time to process what had happened in a space that was hers, where she could sit with the reality of it without the full force of his presence preventing clear thought. Her rooms were small and practical, 2 spaces above the herbalist supply shop where she worked part-time, with windows that faced east, and a kitchen barely large enough for one person to cook in without turning sideways. She had made it warm through accumulated small choices, through the dried bundles hanging from the ceiling beams, and the worn rugs, and the shelf of books that her mother had given her, and that she had added to carefully over years. She sat at her kitchen table with tea she could not taste, and tried to think clearly about what she knew. The wolf spirit was real. She had always believed this, had organized her entire adult life around the belief. But belief and confirmation were different things, and the confirmation was sitting in her chest like a warm coal, sending heat into spaces that had been quietly cold for a very long time. He had been sealed, which she had suspected from the binding marks in the temple floor. But the sealing had been a deliberate act of suppression rather than protective containment, which shifted the nature of his captivity from preservation to imprisonment. The Council of Alphas had been involved. The Council of Alphas that currently governed every aspect of life in Ashvale and the surrounding territory, that controlled resource distribution and rank assignments and the mediation of disputes and the terms under which anyone could leave or enter Packlands, was connected to the imprisonment of a divine spirit in the mountain above the village. She had known, in an abstract way, that the institutional erasure of the old priestess orders was political in motivation. Her mother had told her this, and the evidence of it was visible in the specific shape of what had been removed from Pack history, the gaps that appeared when you looked for information about the old ways, the particular absence of documentation around key historical moments that should have produced significant records, but abstract knowing and concrete confirmation, again, were different things. And the confirmation of Kale's words was turning abstraction into something with edges and weight and implications she was only beginning to trace. She was still tracing them when someone knocked on her door, which was unusual because she did not typically receive visitors, and when she opened it, she found Mira Dawnfall on her threshold with 2 cups of something hot and an expression that said she had been deciding whether to knock for longer than the knock itself had taken. Mira was one of the 3 women who had been denied ranking consideration at the autumn assembly. She was 24, beta secondary designation, from a family that had been quietly on the wrong side of council politics for 2 generations. She and Seren were not precisely friends in the way that the word usually implied. That is to say, they had not arrived at closeness through casual accumulation of shared experiences, but rather through a more deliberate mutual recognition of something that the other understood, and that most people in the village either did not understand or preferred not to acknowledge. They had that specific kind of friendship that forms between people who have both been told, in different ways and through different mechanisms, that they do not belong where they are standing. "I heard you were on the mountain this morning," Mira said. She held out one of the cups. "I made tea." Seren accepted the cup and stepped back to let her in. "You always hear when I was on the mountain. Someone has to keep track of you." Mira settled into the chair across the table with the ease of someone who had sat in it before. "There is something different about you today. You look like someone who has just received either very good or very terrible news, and has not yet determined which category applies." "Both," Seren said, simultaneously. Mira looked at her over the rim of her cup for a moment. She was the kind of perceptive that came from spending a lifetime in the position of needing to read rooms accurately for survival purposes, which meant that her assessments were rarely decorative. "The temple," she said. "The temple. Something happened. Something happened." Mira set down her cup. "Are you going to tell me what it was, or are you going to make me extract it in pieces?" Seren looked at her closest, and, she realized in this moment, most trusted person in the village, and she made a decision that was less calculation than recognition. If what Kale had implied about the council was true, then the events that were coming were not going to be navigable alone. She was a single woman, with no rank, no institutional backing, and no resources beyond her own knowledge and whatever relationship she was in the process of forming with a newly unsealed divine spirit. Mira had networks, careful and underground, and built through years of quiet solidarity with others who existed at the margins of official power. Mira had also, for as long as Seren had known her, possessed a quality of absolutely unshakable loyalty to anyone she had decided deserved it, that functioned in practice like a supernatural ability, even without any actual supernatural designation. "The wolf spirit," Seren said, "is awake." The silence that followed was very full. Mira did not move for a moment that lasted longer than moments typically do. Then she picked up her tea again with very steady hands and said, "Tell me everything." Seren told her everything. Or rather, she told her what she had experienced, and what Kale had said, and what she understood from it, leaving the gaps where her understanding ran out, and being honest about where inference ended and knowledge began. Mira listened with the complete attention that was one of her most significant qualities, asking no questions until Seren had finished, and then asking 3 questions in rapid succession that went directly to the structural implications rather than the emotional ones, which confirmed what Seren had always believed about her, which was that underneath the ordinary surface of her daily life, Mira Dawnfall was someone built for exactly the kind of moment that had not, until recently, appeared. The questions were, how did the council seal him the first time? Do we know anyone who has access to the historical records that were removed from the Pack Library? And what does he need from you specifically in order to fully materialize in the physical world? Serene answered the third question first, because it was the one she had the most information about and the least emotional clarity on. "I am what the old texts called a tetherborn," she said. "It is a bloodline designation, not a formal rank. It means I carry the capacity to anchor a spirit, being to physical existence, to provide a point of stable connection between their nature and the material world. Without that connection, Kale can exist in the temple. He can be present, and conscious and capable of communication, but his ability to act in the world beyond the temple grounds is limited. With it, he can move, he can intervene, he can be present in ways that make a difference. She paused. The tether bond is also, in the old tradition, a mate bond. They are the same thing. You cannot separate the anchoring function from the relational one. Mira absorbed this with the same steadiness she had applied to everything else. So you have a potential mate bond with a divine wolf spirit who has just woken up after 300 years and immediately told you that the governing council of your pack was responsible for imprisoning him. That is an accurate summary. And you have been unknowingly preparing for this your entire life through the maintenance of a devotional practice that everyone in this village has been mocking you for. Also accurate? Mira looked at her for a moment, with an expression that was many things at once. I have been saying for years that your dedication to that temple was going to amount to something significant, she said. I did not anticipate quite this particular form of significant, but I wanted on record that I was directionally correct. Despite everything, Seren almost smiled. It is on record. Good. Mira straightened in. Her chair, and something in her bearing, shifted. The way a person shifts when they move from receiving information to processing its operational implications. Then here is what we are going to do. I have a contact in the Eastern Archives, someone who was removed from the official pack records office 3 years ago after she started asking questions about documentation gaps in the historical files. She has been compiling information quietly since then. I think it is time I made an introduction. If you are watching this right now and you are realizing that Mira is exactly the ally that this story needed, you are absolutely correct. And I need you to show this video some love right now, because we are building towards something extraordinary. And I need to know you are with us. His name, in the oldest records that still existed, was Cale Vorthane, and he had been born in the period before the current pack structure existed. In the time when the relationship between werewolves and the spirit world had been understood as interdependent, rather than hierarchical. He had not been born divine. This was something Seren had not known, and that he told her on her second morning in the temple, when she arrived at the usual hour and found him already present, already awake, sitting in the place where the dais had been with the carved wolf gone as though it had never existed, his attention focused on something she could not see that seemed to occupy the middle distance between this world and whatever other world his awareness still partly inhabited. He was, she had discovered, already partially familiar to her in ways that went beyond 11 years of one-sided conversation, in the way that the contents of a room can become familiar through repetition before you have ever been inside it. He had been born human, or as close to human as the beings of his particular era and bloodline had been, which was to say that he had been born werewolf, a beta of unusual ability from a family with a long history of spiritual sensitivity. He had become what he was through a process the old tradition called spirit marriage, a merging of mortal and divine that was not metaphorical, but literal, that happened when a spirit entity found in a specific mortal being the precise combination of qualities it required to enter the physical world in an ongoing and sustained way, and when that mortal agreed to the merging, knowingly, and with full understanding of what it would cost. What it cost was the separation of himself from the ordinary continuity of mortal life, the exchange of a finite span of singular experience for something larger and longer and more responsible, and, in certain ways, lonelier. He had done it because the spirits were retreating. He told her this with the matter-of-fact quality of someone describing events that were long past, but that still carried their original weight, the way people talk about pivotal decisions when they have had 300 years to make peace with the consequences. The relationship between the physical world and the spirit world required maintenance the way any relationship did, required attention and reciprocal acknowledgement, and the small daily work of choosing connection over disconnection. The pack had been drifting from that maintenance for generations, pulled by the very human and very understandable desire for autonomy, for self-sufficiency, for a governance structure that did not require deferring to entities whose nature was not fully comprehensible. The spirits were not angry about this. They were not punishing the pack for the drift. They were simply, slowly, withdrawing, responding to the absence of relationship the way any living thing responds to prolonged absence of nourishment. Kale had seen where that withdrawal would end and had chosen to become the bridge. He had married the spirit that had asked, and he had become something neither fully mortal nor fully divine, and for a long time it had worked. Then the council had formed. Not the current council, the proto-council, the first gathering of dominant alphas who had recognized in each other a shared interest in concentrating governance power, in consolidating the distribution of rank and resource into a structure that they controlled, in building an institutional framework that would perpetuate their dominance across generations. They had looked at the relationship between Kyle and the pack, at the authority that relationship conferred on him, and they had understood that what they wanted was incompatible with his continued influence. They had not been able to kill him in any conventional sense, which is where the binding marks came from, where the 3-century seal came from, where the systematic removal of his story from the pack's collective memory came from. They had sealed him, and then they had sealed the knowledge of his sealing, and then they had sealed the knowledge that there had ever been anything worth knowing, layer after institutional layer, until the temple on the mountain was an embarrassment rather than a sacred site, and the women who tended it were objects of pity rather than respect. The seal was built to last indefinitely, he said, in the quiet of the second morning, unless 2 conditions were simultaneously met. The first was a tether born of the original priestess line, maintaining active devotion for a period of no less than 10 years. The second was an eclipse alignment of the specific astronomical configuration that occurs only once every 3 centuries. He looked at her with those amber eyes that already felt like something she had always known. They believed both conditions were effectively impossible. The priestess lines had been systematically disrupted, and 300 years felt like a safe buffer on the astronomical side. They underestimated my mother, Seren said. They underestimated your mother, he agreed. And her mother before her, and the mother before that. Your line has been keeping this specific faith alive through 8 generations of active institutional suppression, Seren. The word underestimated is perhaps insufficient. She looked at her hands, which were wrapped around the ceramic cup she had started bringing to the morning sessions because the temple was cold, and the ritual of holding something warm helped her stay grounded in her body during conversations that had a consistent tendency to pull her out of it. She thought about the lineage of women who had come before her, who had done what she had done and more, who had held something sacred against the machinery of its erasure, not because there was any institutional support for doing so, but because they had understood that some things are worth holding, regardless of whether the holding is recognized or rewarded. She felt them in the room with her, all those mothers and grandmothers and great-grandmothers, present in the way that people are present when what they gave you was the foundation that made everything possible. What do you need from me? She asked. Specifically, for the tether bond. I know the general principle, but I do not know the mechanism. He was quiet for a moment. When he answered, there was a care in his voice that she understood was not performance, but precision. The care of someone who has thought very hard about how to say a true thing that contains multiple layers of implication. The tether bond develops naturally when a tetherborn is in sustained contact with the spirit they carry the resonance for, he said. It is not a ceremony or a ritual. It does not require a specific action on your part. What it requires is proximity, conversation, genuine relationship. The bond exists as a potential between us, has existed as a potential since the moment of my sealing, because the original design of the seal included a pathway for its breaking that required exactly what you are, and what you are has always been oriented toward exactly what I am. The potential becomes an actuality through the simple fact of being together. Another pause. Which is to say that what I need from you is what you have already been giving, in a different form. Presence, attention, honesty, the specific quality of care that you already know how to direct toward me. She absorbed this, and the mate bond aspect of it, she said, careful with each word, also develops naturally, he said. Also does not require a specific ceremony or a decision made in the abstract. It requires that we know each other genuinely, and that the knowing produces what genuine knowing of a true person generally produces, which is something more than intellectual recognition. He met her eyes directly. I want you to know that I am not asking you to feel anything you do not feel. I want you to know that I understand the weight of what this means, and that I have absolutely no interest in your obligation. The bond can be maintained at the level of anchor and spirit, if that is what you choose, and I will not ask for more than you freely offer. She thought about all of this for a long moment. Then she said, You have been hearing my prayers for 11 years. Yes. Then you know a great deal about me. Yes. Though I would like to note that I am aware of the asymmetry that creates, and I would like to address it through the general process of you getting to know me in return, if you are willing. She felt the pull between them, which had been present since the first morning and which she was learning to interpret rather than simply feel. It had the quality of homecoming. It had the quality of recognition. It had the quality of something that had been true before either of them had chosen it, which was a strange and slightly frightening quality for a feeling to have, and which was also, underneath the strangeness and the slight fright, the most fundamentally comfortable thing she had ever encountered. I am willing, she said. Outside, the mountain kept its secrets. Inside the temple, they began the long and careful work of learning each other. And if you are watching this, and thinking that the tender beginning of this relationship is almost too much to hold in your chest, I completely understand. Because I feel it too, and I want you to drop a comment right now, telling me who you would be in this world. A pack member, a priestess, a council member who is starting to wonder about the official story. Because I want to know where you would stand. And we are going to need all of those perspectives for where this story goes. The contact in the Eastern Archives was named Thessaly, and she was 53 years old, and she had spent the last 3 years in a small house at the edge of the Pack territory with a substantial collection of copied documents that she was not supposed to have, and a quiet and absolute certainty that the Pack leadership was built on a foundation that would not survive close examination. She received Mira and Seren in her kitchen with the particular warmth of someone who has been working alone for too long and is very glad to have company. And she made tea, and she sat down across from them and said, I have been waiting for someone to come asking these questions. The documents she had were fragments rather than a complete record, because the complete record had been systematically destroyed. But fragments in the right order could reconstruct a picture. And Thessaly had spent 3 years arranging her fragments into an order that was increasingly legible. What they showed, stripped to their essential outline, was this. The original sealing of the wolf spirit had been a political act carried out by 5 dominant alphas who called themselves the First Formation, and who had justified it to the broader pack population through a carefully constructed narrative of threat, a story in which Kale had been presented not as a protective spirit guide, but as an unpredictable and uncontrollable supernatural entity whose influence over pack affairs was becoming increasingly authoritarian. The story was false. Thessaly had the documents that demonstrated its falseness, correspondence between the 5 alphas that made their actual motivations visible, the redistribution of authority that followed the sealing, the institutional structures they built in its absence. What Thessaly had not been able to document until now was the continuing relevance of those events to current governance. Because the current council was not the First Formation. The First Formation had been dead for centuries, but the institutional framework they had built had been inherited and maintained and refined by every subsequent generation of dominant alphas, who had been taught to understand it not as the product of a historical crime, but as the natural and legitimate structure of pack governance, and who had therefore had no reason to question it. The ones who had questioned it had been managed through the same mechanisms the First Formation had developed: marginalization, narrative control, the careful management of information. There are 3 members of the current council, Thessaly said, spreading a series of documents across the table, who are aware of the full historical record, who know what was done and why. The rest believe the official narrative. And within those 3, there is one, Elder Mordecai Vane, who has been actively maintaining the institutional structures specifically designed to prevent the seal from breaking. She looked at Seren directly. He has been watching your temple visits. Has had watchers on the mountain path for at least 5 years. Seren went still. She had known she was considered eccentric, had known her morning walks attracted comment, had understood the mild contempt with which most of the pack viewed her practice. She had not known she was under active surveillance. She processed the specific quality of this information, the way it recontextualized 5 years of mornings, and then she set the processing aside because it was not the most operationally relevant thing on the table. "Does he know the seal is broken?" she asked. "Not yet," Thessaly said. "The Watchers are pack members who report to him on a weekly schedule, not immediately. His most recent report would have been 3 days before the eclipse. He will have one due in 4 days." She paused. "Which means you have 4 days before the A. People who have been actively working to prevent exactly what has just happened discover that it has happened. 4 days. Seren turned this over in her mind, measuring it against what she knew about the situation and what Kale had told her about his own current capabilities. He was awake and present, but his ability to act beyond the temple grounds was still limited without the tether bond being more fully established. He had physical form inside the temple, the ability to speak and think and advise and, in certain conditions, to make himself perceptible to anyone who came to the temple. But extending that physicality into the broader world required the anchoring that the tether bond provided. In 4 days, if Mordecai Vane learned what had happened, he would move to reseal what had been unsealed, and he had 3 centuries of refined technique to do it with. What would resealing require? Mira asked, which was exactly the question Seren had been building toward. The original sealing required 5 dominant alphas and a specific ritual framework, Thessaly said. But the refinements that have been made to the seal's design over 3 centuries have simplified the maintenance requirements considerably. A single alpha of sufficient dominance with access to the original ritual objects and the knowledge of the correct sequence could theoretically reseal it. She paused. Mordecai Vane has sufficient dominance. He has always retained personal custody of what the Council records describe as ceremonial heritage objects, and he has spent decades studying the historical record that he keeps suppressed from everyone else. "So we have 4 days," Seren said, "to establish enough of the tether bond that resealing becomes impossible, or significantly more difficult than it currently would be, or to remove Mordecai Vane's capacity to perform the resealing," Mira said. She said it with the matter-of-fact quality that characterized her operational thinking, not as a suggestion of violence, but as a category of solution. His knowledge, his access to the ritual objects, or his institutional authority. Remove any one of those, and resealing becomes impractical. Thessaly looked between them with the expression of someone who had been a solo researcher for 3 years and is adjusting rapidly to the experience of having active collaborators. "I have been building a comprehensive documentation package," she said, "intended for distribution to the broader pack. Population, a complete historical record of what was done, with the evidence I have been able to compile. It is not finished, but it is close." "How close?" Seren asked. "A week. Perhaps a week and a half. We have 4 days." Thessaly was quiet for a moment. "Then we prioritize," she said. "The core elements. The correspondence between the first formation members. The documentation of the ritual objects. The record of the surveillance network Mordecai has maintained. What I can assemble in 4 days may not be the complete picture, but it may be enough to be credible to people who are currently operating on the official narrative." They worked through the implications for the rest of the afternoon, building a provisional plan in 3 simultaneous tracks. Seren would continue the morning sessions with Kale, focusing deliberately on deepening the tether bond, not because she was forcing an emotional process, but because she understood that the authentic relationship was already developing and that she did not need to manufacture anything, only to be fully present to what was already happening between them. Mira would use her network to begin quiet, careful conversations with the pack members, who had the most reason to be receptive to a different account of the historical record. The families like her own, that had been managed and marginalized, and who had always sensed, even without documentation, that the official story was not the complete story, and Thessaly would compress a week's worth of documentation work into 4 days. It was a plan with significant gaps and no guarantee of working. Seren recognized this clearly and was not comforted by the clarity, but considered it more useful than false reassurance. She was a woman who had been kneeling on cold stone for 11 years, in service of something she could not see or prove, and who had learned in that practice that honest assessment of a situation and faith in proceeding despite uncertainty were not contradictory qualities. You did the work that was in front of you. You kept the fire lit. You did not require the outcome to be guaranteed before you were willing to try. She went back to the mountain the next morning with this orientation settled into her bones, and she told Cale everything, and he listened the way he always listened, with his complete attention and without the reflexive reassurance that would have been less honest than useful. And when she finished, he said, "Mordecai Vane was not a member of the first formation. He is something potentially more dangerous." "What do you mean?" "He is a true believer," Cale said. "The first formation knew what they were doing was wrong, by their own standards, and they did it anyway out of naked self-interest. Mordecai Vane genuinely believes that the story he maintains is true. He has constructed his entire worldview around the legitimacy of what was done to me. For him, this is not about protecting power, or not only about that. It is about defending what he understands as the rightful order of things. That kind of belief is harder to dislodge than self-interest, because self-interest can be redirected. But conviction requires something more fundamental to change." She considered this. "Is there any version of this where he chooses differently?" Kyle was quiet for a moment, that held more weight than his silences usually did. "There is always, in principle, a version where anyone chooses differently. Whether that version is practically accessible given the specific formation of a specific person is a different question." Another pause. "What I know of Mordecai Vane from the limited information I have been able to perceive through the seal is that he has a daughter, approximately your age. Beta designation. She was denied ranking consideration at the spring assembly 2 cycles ago by her own father's vote, because he abstained rather than recuse himself, and his abstention functioned as a casting vote against her. She has not spoken to him since." Seren absorbed this specific detail with the focus of someone identifying a structural point, the place in a complex system where the application of pressure might produce a different result than expected. A man who had built his life around the righteousness of a system that he then deployed against his own child. A daughter who had arrived, through personal experience, at a knowledge she had not gone looking for, the knowledge that the official story and the lived experience of that story did not match. "What is her name?" Seren asked. "Elowen," Cale said. "Do you see what is happening here? Can you feel the way that this story is building its structure? Finding every door it can, every person who holds a key? If you are not subscribed yet, please subscribe right now, because the middle of this story is where everything accelerates, and I need you to have notifications on." Elowen Vane was not, as it turned out, difficult to find. She was running the PAC's small secondary school, a position she had taken after her ranking denial, because it was the highest status role available to her without the formal rank she had been blocked from achieving, and because she was, by all accounts, excellent at it in a way that made the rank denial look increasingly foolish to anyone who paid attention to what she was actually accomplishing. She had her father's eyes and none of his politics, and a quality of contained anger that Seren recognized immediately, the specific kind of anger that belongs to people who have been given an unambiguous view of a system's true nature and have been living with the knowledge ever since. Mira made the introduction, because Mira knew everyone, and because she had the particular social skill of arriving in someone's life at exactly the moment when that person had been quietly waiting for someone to arrive. She brought Seren to the school at the end of the teaching day, after the children had gone, and she introduced them simply and accurately, and let the conversation find its own shape. Elowen listened to what they had to say with the same stillness that intelligent people apply to information that is simultaneously new and confirming something they already suspected. When they finished, she was quiet for a moment that felt like the pause before a decision, rather than the pause before a response. My father has been conducting a private seminar in the history of pack governance for the last 30 years, she said finally. He has invited specific young alphas he identifies as promising and has taught them a version of pack history that the general population does not have access to. I attended the first 2 sessions before I understood what I was hearing and stopped going. She paused. I have notes. The notes were extraordinarily detailed, because Elowen was extraordinarily detail-oriented, and because she had understood even at 18, even before she fully grasped the significance of what she was writing down, that precise documentation of this material was important. They added to Thessaly's file in ways that completed connections that had previously been inferred, and they provided the most critical thing the documentation package had been missing, which was a direct account from a named witness with an unimpeachable reason for testifying truthfully. They had 3 days remaining. The work of those 3 days was the kind of work that does not look dramatic from the outside and is in fact the hardest kind. The sustained application of focused effort to a problem with uncertain outcome. The maintenance of clarity and purpose in the face of everything that could go wrong. Seren spent her mornings at the temple. She spent them fully present to the relationship that was building between her and Kale, with a thoroughness she had not previously allowed herself, not because she was forcing a bond, but because she understood that her previous approach to their conversations had contained a protective layer of reserve. The reserve of someone who has been giving for a long time without expectation of return, and who has therefore learned to protect herself from hoping too directly. She allowed herself to let that reserve down. She told him things about herself that she had not said to anyone. The texture of her grief for her mother. The specific shape of the loneliness that came from being dedicated to something invisible in a community that valued visibility. The complicated relationship she had with her own faith. The moments when she had wondered if she was devoted or simply stubborn and had not always been able to tell the difference. He told her things in return. He told her what it had been like to be sealed, which was unlike anything she had a comparison for, and which he described with the restraint of someone who is being honest about the magnitude of an experience without asking their audience to carry more of its weight than necessary. He told her about the world he had grown up in, the period before the current pack structure, with the specificity of someone describing a place they loved, which was different from nostalgia, because it was not tinged with loss, so much as with a forward-looking affection for what had been possible and might be possible again. He told her about the original binding, the consent he had given, the spirit he had merged with, in terms that made her understand the nature of what he was more fully than she had before. The human origin and the divine adoption and the particular kind of existence that resulted from having been made of 2 things that were not originally designed to be a single thing. The bond deepened in the way that real things deepen, through time and honesty and the accumulation of moments that were not dramatic, but that were genuine. She felt it as a warmth that had no external source, a sense of connection that was directional, that pulled her attention toward him even when she was elsewhere, that gave her a peripheral awareness of his presence in the temple on the mountain above the village that was not intrusive or distracting, but simply there, like a known thing at the edge of consciousness. She did not analyze it too extensively. She trusted what it was. She had been trusting what it was, without being able to name it, for 11 years. On the evening of the second of their 3 days, she was walking back from Thessaly's house with a packet of copied documents under her arm when she became aware that she was being followed. She had grown up walking these streets, knew every variation in the cobblestones and every pattern of shadow at every hour, and she felt the following as a disruption in a familiar texture before she consciously registered any specific detail. She did not change her pace. She turned toward her own street and moved with the unhurried quality of someone who has not noticed anything, while the part of her mind that was not managing her movement was calculating possibilities. The surveillance network. One of Mordecai's watchers. 4 days had become 3 days had become 2 days remaining, and something in the timeline had accelerated. She reached her door and went inside and stood in the dark of her entry hall for a moment, thinking. Then she felt the warmth at the edge of her consciousness shift, become more direct, and understood that Kale was aware of what had just happened, was attending to it through the connection between them, and that he was telling her something through the quality of that attention. Not words, but information nonetheless. The information of a presence that was engaged and alert, and underneath both of those things, something that she read as protective. She went upstairs and wrote 3 letters, one to Mira, one to Thessaly, and one to Elowen, and she sent them with the night messenger service that the village used for communication after curfew hours. And she went to bed with the full knowledge that the morning was going to bring something she was as ready for as she was going to get. She was right. The council summons arrived at dawn, delivered by 2 beta enforcers who were politely formal and deliberately blank in their expressions, in the way that people are when they are carrying out instructions that they have not been asked for their opinion on. The summons was for an immediate appearance before the full council at the governance hall. Cited reason: irregular activities in restricted temple zones, which was interesting, she thought, as she dressed carefully in the blue-gray dress she wore for occasions that required her to be taken seriously, because the temple had not been officially designated a restricted zone, which meant that the summons itself contained a revelation about how the council had been classifying the space, and this was exactly the kind of detail that would matter in the conversation she was about to have. She went. She went with the documents under her arm, and with Mira at her side, who had received the letter and arrived at her door at the same time as the enforcers, and had simply inserted herself into the proceeding with the quality of someone who belongs wherever they decide to be. She went with Thessaly's assembled file in its most portable form, distributed across several people who were not walking directly beside her, who would present it to the broader pack if she did not emerge from the governance hall within a reasonable time window. She went with Elowen's testimony in writing, and with Elowen herself, following at a distance that was deniable until it was necessary to make it undeniable, and she went with the warmth at the edge of her consciousness, steady as a banked fire, with the directional awareness that was learning her the way she was learning it, with the knowledge that the bond between them was becoming something that the seal that had been designed could not easily undo, because bonds of this nature, freely chosen and honestly built, were not the kind of thing that could be dissolved by someone who had not been part of their making. The council chamber was a large room built for the purpose of impressing the people who were called into it, with high ceilings and a raised semicircular bench where the 7 council members sat, and a floor-level position for the person being addressed that was designed to communicate the relative status of the parties present. She walked into it and stood in the floor-level position with the posture of someone who had been trained by 11 years of kneeling on cold stone, which was to say with the posture of someone who understood the difference between the formal position of the body and the interior state, and who had long since learned to keep them separate. Mordecai Vane was in the center seat. She had seen him from a distance at public assemblies, but never at this proximity, and the closer view confirmed what Cale had told her about him, that he was a true believer, that there was in his bearing the specific quality of certainty that belongs to people who have built their lives around a narrative they have never had reason to doubt. He was an older man, well-built and gray-haired, and with the kind of face that had been handsome once and had settled into authority. He looked at her with the calm assessment of someone who had been managing the situation she represented for a long time and who was confident in his ability to continue managing it. "Seren Ashvel," he said, "the council has been made aware of a potential irregularity regarding your activities at the Mountain Temple." "What kind of irregularity?" she said. "Reports suggest that the temple site may have experienced some form of structural or environmental disturbance. Given the historical significance of the site, the council has responsibility for ensuring that any such disturbance is properly assessed and, where necessary, addressed." She looked at him. She looked at all 7 of them, reading the room with the perceptiveness that surviving on the margins develops, finding the true believers and the people who believed the official story and the one person, a woman in the second seat from the left, who had a quality of attention that was different from the others, more complicated, more uncertain. "What you are describing as a structural disturbance," she said, "is the breaking of a seal that was placed on the wolf spirit of this pack, 300 high, years ago by 5 dominant alphas who called themselves the First Formation. The room changed. Not dramatically. The ceiling did not crack. No one jumped to their feet, but the quality of attention in the space shifted in the way that air shifts before lightning. charging with something that was about to discharge. "The seal has been broken," she continued, "and the wolf spirit is awake. He has been awake for 3 days. In those 3 days, I have been in regular communication with him, and I have been provided with historical context for his sealing that I believe the full council and the full pack population should have access to." She set the documents on the floor-level table in front of her. "I have documentation here that Thessaly Morn, formerly of the Pack Records Office, has been compiling for 3 years. I have notes from a direct attendee of a private historical seminar conducted by Elder Vane over the last 30 years. I have correspondence fragments from the first formation themselves, and I have the testimony of the wolf spirit, who is awake and present and entirely willing to speak for himself." Mordecai Vane had not moved during this. His bearing had the quality of a man managing a significant internal reaction through long-developed discipline. When he spoke, his voice was level. "What you are describing is an extremely serious claim." "Yes," she said, "it is. The entity you are claiming to have been in contact with, if it exists as you describe, represents a serious supernatural risk to pack stability and governance. That is the official story," she said. "I have documentation that it is not accurate. What happened next is the kind of moment that this story has been building toward from its first sentence. And I need you to understand that every morning on a cold stone floor, every prayer into silence, every year of being called the devota do vazio, the devoted of the empty, all of it was leading exactly here, and I need you to be present for it. So if you have not liked this video yet, please do it now, because what comes next is everything." The door of the governance hall opened, not with force, not dramatically. It opened the way doors open when someone who has the authority to open them does so without hesitation, and the person who came through it was not a person in any ordinary sense of the word, though he wore the form of one. He was the warmth at the edge of consciousness made visible. He was the presence that filled a room when it entered it. He was carrying 300 years of imprisoned waiting in his bearing, with a lightness that spoke less of forgiveness than of absolute certainty that the waiting was over. And his amber eyes were on Seren first, and then on the 7 council members, in the way that an acknowledgement of the specific becomes a confrontation with the general. Elowen had come through the door first, and she had opened it, and she was standing beside it now with the expression of someone who has made a decision they are going to have to live with for a long time, and has already made peace with every consequence of it. Kyle stood in the governance hall of the pack that had imprisoned him, and said nothing for a moment, and the nothing he said had the quality of a judgment that had not yet been articulated, but that was clearly present and clearly formed. Then he said, addressing the council as a whole, with a voice that carried those harmonics, those layers beneath layers, "I am not here to punish anyone for what was done to me. I am here because the woman who freed me has asked me to be present as a witness to the truth she is presenting, and I do not intend to refuse any request she makes that is within my power to honor." He looked at Mordecai Vane with the specific quality of someone looking at a person they understand more completely than that person realizes. What she is asking for is not revolution. It is honesty. It is the acknowledgement of what occurred, and the beginning of a genuine reckoning with what the pack's governance could be if it were built on truth, rather than on the management of a historical lie. Mordecai Vane looked at the spirit standing in the governance hall of the pack he had dedicated his life to protecting, and his expression moved through several stages before settling into something that was not quite what anyone in the room had been expecting. It was not defiance. It was not capitulation. It was the expression of a man encountering, for the first time in his life, a genuine crack in the foundation of his certainty. And it was not a comfortable expression to look at, because the discomfort of it was real and not performed. The discomfort of someone who is in the process of discovering that the story they have built their life around requires a fundamental revision that is going to cost them something they cannot entirely calculate. "You are not what I was told you would be," he said to Kale. "No," Kale said. I'm not. What were you told I would be?" And Mordecai Vane, elder of the council and maintainer of 300 years of institutional lie, said, in the voice of someone speaking the official narrative for the last time. "Dangerous. To what?" Cale asked. A long silence. "To the order. To the order as it exists," Cale said. "Or to the order as it could exist." The crack in the certainty widened. You could see it if you were watching the elder's face, the specific quality of a true believer, encountering the first genuine challenge to their belief from a source that cannot be dismissed through the usual mechanisms. He could not dismiss Cale as a threat through the mechanisms of institutional authority, because Cale was standing in the room with the full evidence of what he was, undeniable and unarmed. And the evidence did not match the story, and the mismatch was not something a disciplined and honest mind could manage for long. What happened over the following hours was not simple, and was not complete. Real things rarely complete themselves in a single day, but what happened was real, and it was a beginning. And in the council chamber of a pack that had been built on suppression of a 3-century-old truth, the documentation was presented, and the testimonies were given, and the crack widened into something that could not be resealed through any mechanism currently in Mordecai Vane's possession, because what had been uncontained was not just a spirit, but a story. And stories, once told to enough people who are ready to hear them, cannot be called back. Of the 7 council members, 2 resigned within the week. 3 requested access to the full historical record and began a formal review process. 1, the woman in the second seat from the left, who turned out to be a former student of the suppressed priestess tradition who had spent her career working quietly within the system toward exactly this outcome, immediately proposed a governance reform commission. And Mordecai Vane, to the surprise of everyone including himself, did not attempt to reseal the temple. He went home, and he did not come out of his house for 2 days, and when he emerged, he looked like someone who had spent those 2 days doing a specific and necessary kind of interior work. And he requested a private conversation with his daughter, and whatever happened in that conversation was not witnessed by anyone outside of it, but Elowen emerged from it looking like someone who was given away a grief she had been carrying for a very long time. The ritual objects in Vane's personal collection were surrendered to the Governance Reform Commission. Without them, the technical requirements for resealing could not be met. Without the institutional will to reseal, which was eroding daily as the pack population absorbed the documentation that Thessaly and Elowen and Mira distributed through every network they had built, the practical threat diminished toward a level that remained worth monitoring but did not require constant emergency-level attention. This is not to say that everything became easy. Nothing about what was happening was easy, and the story of a pack reckoning with the truth of its own history is a long story and a painful one, full of resistance and denial and the complicated grief of people who have built their identities around a version of their community's past that has just been substantially revised. But it was happening. And the fact that it was happening, that the conversation was now in the open rather than suppressed, that the pack members who had always sensed the gap between official story and lived experience now had documentation and a witness and a figure from their own suppressed tradition, standing in the physical world as evidence that what they had sensed was real, that mattered in ways that were going to unfold over years and decades rather than weeks. Seren stood on the mountain path on the morning after the governance hall. Confrontation, in the cold gray light before sunrise, and she looked up at the temple, and she felt the warmth at the edge of her consciousness that was learning her the way she was learning it, and she thought about her mother's hand, and she thought about 8 generations of women who had kept the fire lit, and she thought about the specific quality of faith that is not the absence of doubt, but the decision to continue in the presence of it. And she felt very clearly that she was standing at the beginning of something rather than the end of it. She climbed the path. He was at the door when she arrived. He had begun meeting her there in the last few mornings. A small habit that had formed without discussion, the kind of small habit that forms between people who are becoming part of each other's daily structure. He looked at her in the early light, with those amber eyes that she had learned like a language, and that were becoming legible to her in new registers every day. And she felt the bond between them with its full warmth, not the potential of it, but the actuality of it, present and growing and deeply, rootedly theirs. Well, she said. Well, he agreed. What happens now? He was quiet for a moment, and the mountain was quiet around them, and the village below was just beginning to produce the small sounds of waking, and the temple behind him held the smell of old wood and morning light, and she felt the full weight of the moment with its past and its future both present in it. All those silent mornings accumulated into this one, all those prayers into silence that had been heard, the specific, impossible, beautiful fact of where she was standing and who was standing with her. Now we do the work, he said. The work of what comes after the beginning, which is harder than the beginning and less dramatic and more important. His expression held the thing that had no word for itself, the recognition that had no comparison, the feeling of a true thing that had been true before it was chosen, and was all the truer for having been chosen anyway. And we do it together. She stepped forward, and he met her, and the door to the temple was open behind them, and the morning light was coming up over the mountain in the particular way it came, turning the eastern sky from gray to pale gold, and the bond between the devoted priestess and the awake wolf spirit was there in the space between them, and in the space that they were becoming, warm and certain and freely given, the kind of thing that 300 years of institutional suppression had not managed to prevent, and that nothing currently in the world had the specific architecture to undo. She took his hand. He held it, simple as that, and profound as that, in the way that the simplest things are always the most profound. And if you are here right now at the end of this story with tears in your eyes, or warmth in your chest, or the very specific feeling of having witnessed something that was worth witnessing, then you understand exactly why this channel exists. And I want you to tell me in the comments the single word or phrase that you would use to describe what Seren did over those 11 years, because I think there are many different words for it, and I want to hear all of them. And please subscribe if you have not, because we have more stories like this one, stories about the people who kept going when keeping going was the only thing anyone had asked of them, and what happened when the keeping going turned out to have been exactly right all along. Epilogue. The Governance Reform Commission took 18 months to complete its initial review, and 5 years to implement its first major structural changes. This is the pace at which real institutional change happens, and it is worth saying clearly so that the story is honest about what transformation actually requires, which is sustained effort across time by more people than any single story can contain. Seren was a member of the commission. Mira chaired its communication and outreach division. Thessaly was appointed the official historian of the review process and produced a 3-volume documented account of the PAC's actual history that became, over the following decade, the standard historical text in every educational setting in the territory. Eloan Vane was eventually granted the ranking recognition that had been denied her, though she declined it when it was offered, on the grounds that a ranking system that required reform before it could recognize her value had not yet earned the right to define it, and she proposed a comprehensive review of the ranking criteria as a counteroffer, which was eventually accepted, and resulted in changes that benefited approximately 300 PAC members who had been systematically undervalued by the original metrics. Mordecai Vane lived for another 8 years after the governance hall confrontation. He spent those years in a form of public engagement that was not quite redemption and not quite atonement. But that was honest, which was perhaps more than redemption. The ongoing work of a person who understood what they had done, and who chose to do something useful, with the remaining time rather than retreating into justification or despair. He testified before the commission. He provided his own documentation. He sat with his daughter more days than not in the last years, and whatever they said to each other in those hours was between them. But the quality of what was visible from the outside was something that people who loved them both were grateful for. Kyle's presence in the physical world strengthened as the tether bond deepened, which it did steadily over the years, building the way real things build, through shared time and honest difficulty and the specific intimacy of two people learning each other across the full range of experience, rather than only in the elevated moments. He was not a straightforward presence in a community that was still in the process of understanding what he was, and what his being there meant. There were people who were afraid of him, and people who were resentful of his historical precedent, and people who wanted to use his presence for purposes that he found either misguided or actively contrary to what he stood for. He navigated all of this with a patience that had been developed across 3 centuries, and that he applied without condescension, which was a quality that Serene admired without entirely sharing, as she had a more finite supply of patience for certain things than he did, which was something they negotiated regularly and honestly as part of the ordinary texture of being together. The mate bond formalized in the way that mate bonds do, not through ceremony, though a ceremony came later because the pack had begun the process of restoring the old rights, and both of them felt the value in marking significant things in the presence of community. But through the organic completion of a bond that had been building across 11 years of one-sided devotion and 300 years of sealed waiting, there was a morning when she woke and felt the bond not as warmth at the edge of consciousness, but as something that had moved from the edge to the center, from the peripheral to the foundational, in the way that a true thing settles when it has finished arriving. She lay still for a moment in the early light and felt the full shape of it, and then she turned toward the warmth beside her and said, in the ordinary voice she used for ordinary mornings, "Good morning." And he said, in the voice that had harmonics, that had layers, that she knew now the way she knew her own breathing, "Good morning." And outside, the mountain kept its secrets, except now the secret it kept was not sealed and suppressed, but simply held, the way all sacred things are held, in the space between the private and the shareable, between what belongs to 2 people and what belongs to the world, in the ongoing warmth of a fire that had been kept lit, through every difficulty, through every cold morning, through every year, when the only reason to keep going was the faith that the keeping going mattered. It had mattered. It always had. And now, at last, it was known. If you have stayed with this story all the way to its end, I want you to know that you are exactly the kind of audience that makes this work worth doing, and I am deeply grateful for every comment, every like, every subscription, every share with someone you thought might need this story today. This is what we do here. This is what this channel is for. Stories about the people who kept going, and what happened when they did. We will see you in the next one.